Well, so here we are at our Kalleske winery after just completing 20 vintages. Hard to believe how the time flies, really, isn't it?
2002 to 2021. Yes, indeed. So,
Fair bit's changed from 20 years ago. What do you reckon is the biggest, difference from when we first, our inaugural vintage in '02 versus the 21 we just completed?
well, we have a forklift now for starters,
Certainly makes life easier
and we
helps.
can work during the day rather than at night. So,
That's-
back in the day, started off using the farm front end loader instead of a forklift
right.
with a homemade rotating head, and you're only using it at night time when they weren't using it during the day on the farm. So. You had to be driving pretty accurately to pick up the bins because there was no side shift and, of course, lots of shadows at night too.
Yeah,
So,
that's right. And the other reason we did it after hours and weekends back then was because we actually had our day jobs back then. We both had
we did.
other employers, so we had to do, the winemaking, crushing grapes, pressing, etc., all after hours and on weekends. So, and also it was only the two of us back then, whereas now we are fortunate to have employees to help us out in the winery and office and everything else.
Yep.
So, yes, certainly a fair bit has changed. So,
That's it. And I think one of the most memorable things back then, apart from using the front end loader and so on, but was at the end of our first vintage, we had all of our barrels stacked up on stillage because we had no forklift or cradles. It was when Dad came into the shed and we had a stack of around about, 50, 60 barrels, whatever it was, because the Greenock Shiraz block yielded quite a bit more fruit than they first thought, which was not a bad thing. But was Dad looking at our stack and sort of saying, how many barrels have you got there, boys? Nice big stack. And we sort of said, 50 odd barrels. And he's like, what size are they? 300 litres. And he's doing the maths, and it's 400 litres, 400 bottles per 300 litre barrel. And then he's timing that by the amount of barrels, and his first reaction was, how are you going to sell all of that, boys? You remember that?
I remember that.
Remember
Yes. Well, anyway, fortunately, it has all sold every year for the last, basically 20 years. So it's been good. And I guess the other main thing from '02 to now is we obviously only had two wines back then. The '02 Greenock Shiraz and the '02 Old Vine Grenache, and now there's 20-ish wines in the range, I think. So
Somewhere there.
yeah.
Yep.
And of course, back in the day, Dad and Mum and Kim were selling majority of their grapes to other wineries, Penfolds and the like. And for the last 10 or so years now, we've utilised all the grapes from the Kalleske farm for the Kalleske label.
Yeah, well, that was back in 2009, 2010.
It was the last vintage they sold grapes elsewhere.
Yeah, that's it. 2009 was the last vintage they sold grapes. 2010 was the first one that we used all the fruits. That would have been our ninth vintage. So I guess from starting in '02 to '09, we went from using, nothing, and then the Greenock block and the Old Vine Grenache block to taking everything. And I still remember that there were still some grapes that were meant to go to Penfolds back then. And then at the 11th hour, I'm pretty sure vintage was already underway, and then Dad decided to not sell anything to Penfolds, and it all came here.
Yes, it's all worked out fine in the end. So yes, I guess the other main thing from then to now is that we've actually got concrete to work on and some nice drains, as opposed to crushing grapes on gravel and filling barrels on gravel and the joys that go with that. So it's a much nicer setup now.
Yeah, no, indeed, no. Even trying to stack barrels in the old dairy yard, because that was concrete, so concrete was better than gravel, better than dirt, so but it was big drain in the middle, quite awkward to drive over and stack on.
And of course we started out in your shed at the back of your house, and I'm sure your wife Carol is probably quite happy now not to have red leaves running under her clothesline anymore. When I used to wash some barrels sometimes and it went a bit in the wrong direction. So.
Yeah, I think killed a few rose bushes there. I still remember, so Carol is an accountant, and I still remember that very first vintage, or before vintage, telling her that we'd bought some French oak barrels. And of course she's like, oh, okay, how much do they cost? and said, oh, well, about $1,200, $1,300. And she's like, oh, how many do you get for that price?
Just one.
And it's like, you get one, just one. And of course, the next question was, how many did you buy? So I suppose back then in 2002, we had 2 children under 3, and then we had the third one on the way. So Carol thought we could probably spend money on things other than barrels. That's
Accountants, yeah, well, anyway. Yes, a fair bit has changed. I guess the other main thing is back in 2002, all we had to do was make wine. We didn't have to worry about the sales or the marketing side of things at that stage
no,
yet.
that was the same for 2002, 2003.
That's right. And obviously, when you have, it's all very good to make wine, but when you've actually got to market it, sell it, etc., it's a whole nother dimension to the equation.
Yeah, and I think we're pretty fortunate when we first started off. We had some good reviews from journalists, both in Australia and also international journalists, which helped get the name out there a little bit. And when we were going to see people to taste wines and everything else, we had a few third-party endorsements. And then once they tasted the wines, they were, I guess, thought they were good wines.
And that was the fortunate thing when we were starting off. We got very good reviews from Robert Parker in the US, the sort of one of the most influential international critics at the time, and then James Halliday here in Australia. James Halliday, the man himself, back in the day, and getting really high scores from them certainly made people come to us and want to buy our wine, as opposed to us having to try too hard to sell it, I suppose. Which is good. And I think, also back in the day, we started off in 2002, there wasn't a huge amount of wineries in the Barossa.
It was a good strong vintage as well.
It was a good strong vintage, but like now, every man and his dog sort of makes wine. There's so many labels out there. So I think we were starting off when there wasn't an extreme amount of labels back in 2002.
And also the vineyards had a fantastic provenance to them. So the family had been selling grapes to Penfolds for over 100 years there. And there was around, 5, 6 vineyards that regularly supplied fruit into Penfolds Grange and high-end bin series wines. So I suppose the vineyards had a proven track record as well. So, I know our thinking was, when we did decide to start making wine, if we could do something, we knew we had good quality fruit, so we could make, wines sort of similar quality to what Penfolds were doing. Well, we're going to be on the right track. So.
Yeah, that's right. Now, we knew we had the good quality fruit there to start with, so I just had to try not stuff up in the winery, I suppose. So, it's all worked out well. So, and I guess, the other thing that's changed in 20 years, well, not changed in the actual vineyard or winemaking, but the vineyard, the farm here has been certified organic since 1998, and we, of course, were certified organic from day one in 2002, but if you remember, in the first couple years, we didn't actually put the organic certification on the label. We didn't actually mention it with any of our marketing material, because back in the day, organic wine was generally seen as made by hippies and a bit oxidised, a bit inferior, alternative and whatever. So we wanted to establish ourselves on the merit of the quality in the bottle.
That's it. First and foremost,
not be categorised into this sort of hippie organic camp type thing. But it's certainly amazing now how organic biodynamic is certainly, the in thing with journalists, critics, consumers and so forth.
But I think people generally care about where things come from, how their choices impact on the environment, and much more conscious of what they eat and drink and the choices they make. So
that's right.
Yeah.
But I think I like to say now that we as in we, us, Dad, Mum, Kim in the vineyard did organic and biodynamic before it was cool.
Correct.
So they did it for the right reasons, environmentally, socially, etc., etc. So, which is a pretty good thing that Mum and Dad started that off years ago and went down that path. So,
So I think that that first vintage and these first 2 wines are probably still my favourite. Very close to my heart, and I can remember.
Favourites? The winemaking's gone downhill since then, or
no, but just. we're like kids with new toys on Christmas morning, playing with our winemaking equipment, and always popping bungs on barrels to try the wines. And I still remember too, the Greenock Shiraz looked really good from day one, whereas the old vine Grenache really need a bit of time to kind of come together, to sort of develop in barrel. It didn't look as good, but then it really developed and came up nicely, sort of, I don't know, 15 months, 18 months in oak, whatever it was there. So,
Yeah. No, exactly. So the O2s are still two of my favourites, and we've got both of them here now drinking today, and they're both looking really, really, quite amazing, really.
yeah,
So,
still bright and fresh and held up after 20 years.
No, good quality fruit. So
I still remember too, when the winery was at the back of my place there in the shed, and obviously, Dylan was, I don't know, whatever he was, 2-3 years old, and then when we were emptying or filling barrels, and he'd be running around between them before he went to school. But he would put his, because he had little hands, obviously little kid, he could put his hand in the bunghole,
remember that,
and he'd bring it out, and he'd just like lick his fingers.
Yeah.
And I still remember him saying, "Oh wow, this is a nice wine, Daddy," and stuff like this, and yeah.
Yep. No, remember
And of
that.
course, now he's gone on to nearly completed 4th year uni, and he's just started his first winemaking job. So he's become a winemaker and continuing on with the family tradition. Or
Hopefully you take over here one day. Yes. It's one of the other major things that's changed from the early days is that most of the orders, whether they were mail orders from consumers or even purchase orders from our distributors, trade, sort of wholesale, they used to come in via fax machine.
They did. They all came in on fax, and I distinctly remember that because where we had the winery, barrel storage, but then even our first offices were set up in the shed. Well, actually, before we get onto the fax, but I remember the shed was freezing cold in winter, so even though it was insulated, but it didn't do much against the cold. So we would have beanies and big jackets on trying to keep warm, and then also when it rained, the rain would be belting down on the iron roof and you couldn't hear yourself on the phone. It was all mobile phones and you had to go outside or go and sit in the ute so you could actually hear a conversation. But even so, we had to leave our phones sitting on the fridge by the doorway to get reception. We couldn't actually have them inside the shed too far.
Yes.
But getting back to the fax machine, because it was sort of a phone line, or connected to a phone line in my house, we could hear when the fax machine would ring. And some of those wine releases, or if we had good reviews, the fax would go mental, and then it would just keep ringing until the early hours when you go up in the shed the next day. And I'm pretty sure it was the old thermal roll sort of fax as well.
It was a thermal.
So there'd be this great big pile of paper on the floor, and all these orders had come through overnight, and it was actually pretty cool.
I remember main ones was when we got like 97 to 100 points from Robert Parker, the US critic, and of course the US is differential time, and then came back one morning. So they'd got the review before we even knew about the review, been released in the US, and then came into work in the morning, and the whole basically fax machine was out of paper because had all these inquiries from the US wanting to sell our wine over there, which was a lovely thing. But, we already had a US importer at the time, but it was good though. So, but we've had some great vintages over the years. I mean, that's a good thing about being, in the Barossa, and especially in the northwestern Barossa here at Greenock Mopper. I think that we rarely get a bad vintage.
It's pretty consistent. That's it.
It is. So.
Low disease pressure.
That's right. And I think, one of, I think I wrote it in the last newsletter when we released our 2020 Greenock Shiraz. I've said I think it's one of the best wines to come out of our Kalleske winery in the 20 years, and I stand by that, and I think it's a cracking wine, and I think it'll sell it for a long time, and looks really smart. So 2020 was a great year. It was pretty low quantity, but quality is good. But there's been some other really good years, I think, over the past couple of decades.
No, indeed. I mean, even 2011, which was sort of a fairly cold, wet vintage, quite a difficult vintage, but probably something very memorable from there was our 2011 Clary's GSM. I mean, that went on to pick up best Australian wine at the London International Wine Challenge, and then best biodynamic or organic biodynamic wine in the world. So
Yeah, the world's best, yeah.
that was an incredible achievement from, I guess, what's the so-called lesser vintages in the
Well,
Barossa.
it's not just the so-called lesser vintage, it's generally regarded as Australia's worst vintage ever. So, you know, a lot of people didn't pick their grapes to make wine that year. So, yeah, I guess, but that's you know, a testament, I guess, to the way, you know, Dad, Mum and Kim farm the vineyard here with the organic, biodynamic, biological methods, and then, you know, making it in the winery as we do, which is really not anything, well, it's not rocket science in the winery. You know, if we've got, as we've always said, if you've got the good grapes, nice and traditional, minimalist, just relying on the wild yeast for fermentation and just doing things properly and naturally, really. So it all starts with that good raw ingredient. So, and I must say, as a winemaker from my training and early experience working elsewhere, often, you know, you're told that you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to, you know, add something or take something away or do a fining on this or do that or whatever. So it was actually hard in the early years to embrace that minimalist sort of traditional philosophy of just being hands off and doing less.
Let the wine make itself.
And that's basically it. Just sort of, you know, let the wine make itself and just sort of guide the grapes into the bottle. Of course, it's good to have that technical skill and ability if there is something a little bit haywire or whatever. But it's just, yeah, a matter of learning to be hands off, and that's okay. Sometimes doing nothing is one of the best things you can do. So.
Yes, I suppose over the years, really, we've actually had 3 different wineries. So, you know, our very first winery was in my shed. We did 3 vintages there, and then we outgrew that, and then we put up another shed of a similar size, an 80 by 40 foot shed if you're working in the old scale on the property here. And so then we moved over here. We still had a bit of barrel storage in my shed. But back in those days, it was quite difficult because anyone that wanted to come and see us sort of had to make an appointment, and then we'd open bottles and do a tasting. But it was all very authentic. People enjoyed that. Then in 2009, we purchased our current offices and cellar door in the township of Greenock, and it used to be an old hairdressing salon back then. And then back in the day, I guess both of us, we actually used to catch the bus or wait for catching the bus standing under the veranda of that building. But I mean, little did we know that one day it would become our cellar door.
That's right. I mean, it was the original Greenock General Store back 100 years ago.
That's right, right back in the day. And then I guess we did that major renovation. We took the whole front off the building and then sort of converted that whole look and feel back to how the general store did used to look back then. And then finally we opened our cellar door back in December 2013, and which has really given us a home for the brand, a face of the brand. People can come and visit 7 days, buy wine, try wine, and then we've moved on to doing quite a few functions and events in our back garden area as well. So
yeah, no, it's exactly right. No, it's really good to have people to visit our home, basically. So, no, it's always pleasing when people have, you know, come from, well, not so much these days, but overseas or interstate or whatever, where they've had our wine at one of the restaurants and stuff like that, and they really fall in love with it, and they make the effort to come and see us
out.
So, which is good. So,
I suppose, I mean, the home of our current winery was where we are now. Used to be a hay shed back in the day, and then we retrofitted that. So I guess with, you know, new iron, insulation, concrete, drains, power, extended it, all that sort of stuff.
It was a big job, and also now it's nice to actually have factory-made fermenters or fermenters made professionally by a professional stainless steel company. If you remember when, well, back in 2001, looking forward to the 2002 vintage, our first vintage, when looking at buying stainless steel fermenters, and like they were very, very expensive, and it's like, did some research, it's cheaper to buy a coil of stainless steel, and Dad's got a workshop and a welder, so let's do that, cut our own and weld up our own. So they worked all right for a few years.
They were fine. So we made our own fermenters.
Yeah, that's right. So, but it's amazing how things change.
And they're that good, we were actually able to sell them as well when we decided to buy ones made professionally.
Wasn't too much silicon involved in them.
No.
That's it. I've just poured you the 2021 Clary's. Thought it's appropriate. We've We've had the O2, the inaugural vintage, so we have one 20 vintages later, 2021 Clary's GSM, which I think is, well, don't want to sound too arrogant, but I reckon it's looking pretty smart. So
No, it looks
it was
really
a
good.
good vintage, 21. So do you remember when we first made this wine, 2004 was the first Clary's red? And so we took it to Grandpa's and Grandma's house and said, we've got something to show you, and rocked up with a finished bottle of Clary's and gave it to Grandpa. And he sort of looked at it, and then he thought, I better grab his glasses, and he grabbed his glasses out, put his glasses on. He didn't say a word, but then just a tear came down his eye, a big smile on his face. So it was pretty cool for Grandpa to see his name on a bottle after, he's grown grapes for 50 plus years.
Yeah,
And he really appreciated that acknowledgement, I think. So.
Definitely, yeah. No, he was pretty chuffed to, see his grandsons establish a, new business on the farm, or valuating the grapes, and then to see his name on the bottle. But I suppose his full name is, Clarence Gordon Kalleske, but everyone calls him Clary. But probably the ironic thing is that Clary wasn't really a dry red drinker, was he? I mean,
No.
he was more a fortified man, so even during summer he'd keep the bottle of sherry in the fridge, keep it nice and cold, and you have a nice cold sherry.
He loved his ports probably more than anything. But I guess it's ironic in a way, but at the same time, these grapes that now go into the Clary's dry red, I mean, the oldest is the 1940 block just behind here of Grenache. Back in the day, for most of their life, it would have gone to fortified. So, so it's still appropriate. So
Yeah.
Mm.
So I think that's the nice memories, that he saw us start the winery, and he'd come out and he'd love to, just sit in his ute and watch us crushing, watch things going by.
I mean, he would say that he would have never imagined there to be a winery on the farm.
No, that's right. So
because back in the day, the farm, the Kalleskes on the farm were primary producers. Whether
They
that
were,
was grapes, dairy, pigs. Grandpa loved his pigs, apricots, whatever other fruit trees, cropping, oats, wheat, whatever.
and
we're a primary producer. So
it's still pretty much the same these days, up to a point, isn't it? I mean, our parents, John and Lorraine, and middle brother Kim, they're still primary producers, predominantly farmers. Not quite as many, not quite as diverse as what it used to be years ago, but they've still got their broadacre cropping, growing grain, and then their livestock with the sheep and so on.
Yeah, that's it. But I think it gives, Dad, Mum and Kim good satisfaction to be able to deliver their grapes here to our winery, and then obviously see it in the bottle as wine and see that sold, and whether it gets, good reviews or trophies or whatever it is. I think it's really satisfying for them as growers as well.
More satisfying really as the consumers, people
Absolutely.
People that are, buying the wine and enjoying the wine. I mean, majority of our wines are sold domestically, but we do export to around about 20 different countries. And just for example, I only had an email the other day from someone in Thailand who's really enjoying the Mocha Shiraz. Just come across that. So places like Thailand, Ukraine, we've been in Israel, Mexico, European countries, Asia. It's just, it's quite incredible, isn't it, really, looking back, in that we never thought this would occur.
But I think you're spot on. I think when we first started years ago, and we mentioned about it earlier, about how it was great to get these good accolades from Robert Parker Jr. and from James Halliday in Australia, because that meant a lot when you're starting off to get these third-party endorsements. But now, I think we've learned that we've got so many good customer endorsements, whether that's writing something on TripAdvisor or Vivino or whatever, or ultimately it's them just rebuying our wine every year for the last 20 years. And that's ultimately what
it's just them ringing up with saying how much they enjoy a certain wine and ordering more, or sending an email
that's right.
into Celador.
That's really satisfying.
That's really what it's all about.
These days we don't really put much emphasis on these sort of third-party endorsements, whether it's a wine show or a critic or whatever, because it is the ultimate customer consumer that means the most, and that counts.
Well, because everything stays the same. I mean, the vineyards are all the same. The people growing the grapes are the same. Winemaking's the same. There's the only variables are seasonal, really, but I think that adds a lot of interest to the wine. You get a slightly warmer, dry year, the wines might be that little bit richer and fuller. And if you get a cooler, wetter year, the wines might have a bit more finesse, a bit more elegance.
But that's the beautiful thing about wine, is that it is individual from year to year and
it shouldn't
vineyard
always
to
taste
vineyard,
the same.
winery to winery. So, speaking of warm, dry years, well, it's more a very hot, dry year. Do you remember, obviously, the 2008 vintage, where basically the first 2 weeks of March were at 40 degrees every day. So the grapes just ripened up, shriveled in the vine, everything was ready at once.
Yeah.
Certainly put some pressure on the fermentation capacity in the winery. So it's like a 1 in, I think, 300-year heat wave, what I said at the time. So, but still made some beautiful wine out of it. But that's certainly the more bigger, richer, full-bodied, gutsy wine, as opposed to 2011, which we talked about earlier, which was that cool, wet year that made the more earthy, savoury, spicy wine. And I think, personally, I prefer the 08 over the 11, but some people prefer the 2011.
Yeah, and then you got everything in between.
Oh, that's right.
So
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think over the years too, both of us have been, very fortunate to travel extensively. Whether it's both in Australia or overseas to many different markets, and meeting our consumers that buy our wine, doing wine dinners and tastings and trade visits as well, and supporting our importers, distributors, and that's really been very, very satisfying.
Yeah. And it's satisfying to be seeing the same customers, whether it's restaurants or bottle shops or whatever, now almost 20 years after we first sold wine. They're still enjoying our wine, supporting us, and obviously their customers themselves are, buying our wine from them. So I think that's really, really satisfying.
Definitely. Yeah, and as for the future, well, I think we're in a pretty good spot where we've started from to where we are now. And I mean, my 3 children are all adult, grown-up children. As I mentioned earlier, Dylan's gone down the track of winemaking, and then the 2 girls, I guess, are studying and working in different fields, but sort of covers off on design and marketing and administration and so on. And then over the years too, as the children were growing up, but they spent lots of time working in the winery, doing pump overs of the ferments on weekends in particular, and then often packing mail orders after school in cellar door. As they got a bit older, actually working in cellar door, initially sort of doing platters when they got old enough, serving people with wine, and then working in cellar door properly. So in time, I suppose they all have intentions of coming and working back in the business, but got to go out in the big wide world and
that's
get some
that's
skills
important
and
too,
experience. So.
Exactly. So I mean, my 3 kids are all still in primary school, but they are all saying they want to be winemakers, but they're still a bit too young to know what they really want.
All 3 of them.
That's
All
what they
3 want
said.
to be winemakers.
Well, Lara's only 6, so she doesn't really know about that. Anyway. But, I mean, this year for the first time, both Olivia and Johan actually did pump overs, like meaningful, helped out doing pump overs over vintage, which is good, and they enjoyed it. And, but anyway, they're still young, so see what happens, and if they do come into the business, it's good. If not, whatever, it's up to them. So,
see what happens.
But I mean, I think we'll still keep evolving with different wines as well. We've got our core range that we've always had, but then over the years we've done a lot of different things as well. Whether that's been different varieties like the Shiraz, the Tempranillo, the Zinfandel, things like that, and then of course we've got our divergent genre where we do things a little bit differently. With the first one was the Planarius Viognier, where the white Viognier grapes treated like a red wine on skins, and that was very interesting to see how that was launched in the market. But that got amazing feedback and sold well. And then did the Zeitgeist Shiraz, the unoaked early bottled Shiraz, and then the Parallax Grenache, the early pick Grenache, and then the Shiraz 365, which is 1 year on skin. So I think hopefully in the future we'll continue to make some of these sort of out there different styles. Like it's great to have our core Barossa Shiraz and Grenache and GSM and so forth, but it's really interesting to do these alternative varieties of styles and so forth as well. So.
Yeah, I mean our core range is always going to be there, but it's good and interesting to play around a little bit on the side, isn't it? Just push the boundaries, experiment a little bit, and
Yep.
Yep.
So,
So,
but anyway, it's been a good 20 vintages, a busy, diverse, interesting, never a dull moment. 20 vintages, I think.
no.
But
No, we've always had the support of our families and staff and
that's right.
obviously, our customers that have
So
helped to get to where we are today.
Yep, that's right.
yeah,
So, yep,
yeah.
no, exactly.
So-
So, no, anyway, I guess here's to another 20
That's it.
plus more.
Cheers to the next 20.
Cheers.
Yeah.